Now, when terrorist suspect Daniel Khalife escaped from Britain's Wandsworth prison earlier this month, it focused attention on the state of the country's jails. But with falling government funding and crumbling infrastructure, escapees could be the least of the prison system's problems. Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. Now, Daniel Khalife fled Wandsworth prison by apparently strapping himself under a food delivery truck while dressed as a chef. That makes for great headlines, but in reality, daring escapes are very rare for Britain's prisons. Critics say it's the conditions inside that really need attention.
Britain's prisons are packed, funding for them is falling, and staff are leaving in huge numbers. Conditions are apparently worsening. Germany even recently refused to extradite a suspected drug trafficker, citing the conditions in the UK. The 120 prisons across England and Wales currently hold around 87,000 people. That's less than 1,000 below maximum capacity, and the number of detainees is growing all the time. Wandsworth Prison in London, from where Khalife absconded, is supposed to hold 900 men. It currently houses 1,600, and low staffing at the institution has also been blamed for the security breach. 80 prison officers, who were supposed to be on duty in Wandsworth, were reportedly absent on the day of the escape. Are these issues replicated across the entire prison system in Britain?
Well, let's meet our guests. Joining me from York in the UK is Dean Kingham, a prison and public law lawyer at ReeceThomasWatson Solicitors. In Peterborough is Naomi Murphy, a clinical forensic psychologist. She's also an honorary professor of psychology at Nottingham Trent University. Here in the studio with me is Gloria Morrison, co-founder of the grassroots campaign Joint Enterprise Not Guilty by Association, or JENGA. Also with us is Rob Preece, Communications Manager for the Howard League for Penal Reform. Gloria, I'll come to you first. Is it fair to say that in Britain, people only really discuss prisons when someone gets out of them?
Yeah, I think it's a hugely ignored subject about who we send to prisons, why people are sent to prison, what prisons are for, whether they are rehabilitative or not. It's ignored. Successive governments ignore the problems, and we're sending more and more young boys of colour to prison for crimes they haven't committed under joint enterprise. So, I think it's a hugely ignored problem.
Rob, in your experience, just how bad are Britain's prisons right now?
They're very bad. I should say escapes are quite rare. You could count the number of escapes since 2017 literally on one hand. But it is right to say that we only talk about prisons when something's gone wrong in the main. I haven't seen the same level of interest in prisons in the last couple of weeks at any point in the last sort of 4 or 5 years, I would say. And it's a convenient time to have the conversation because prisons are in a very, very bad state at the moment. We're in a situation where almost 2/3 of prisons in England and Wales are holding more people than they're designed to hold, including Wandsworth, which was the centre of the big story of the escape in recent times. And we are seeing staff shortages across the board as well. And what that means is that people are spending hours on end inside their cells with nothing to do. It's not unusual to hear of people spending up to 23 hours a day inside their cells in prisons where self-harm has been recorded at a rate of once every 9 minutes. Violence is at very high levels as well. And those conditions are not going to help people move on from crime and lead towards safe release and being law-abiding citizens at the end.
Dean, you're in and out of prisons on a weekly basis for your work. Is that typical of what you're seeing?
100%. The prison system is at breaking point. There's been years and years of asset stripping and underfunding, which has meant the rehabilitative opportunities for prisoners has significantly reduced. And we, as a nation, we need a proper, honest, evidence-based debate on what is prison for and what do we want prison to achieve? Because ultimately, the majority of those that go into prison are going to come out. And the key question is, do we want them to come out better than when they went in? And when I say better, what I mean by that is, if they've got substance misuse issues, do we want that to have been properly addressed? If they've got mental health issues, do we want mental health treatment to have been given to them? And sadly, it's far easier to get drugs in prison than it is, for instance, for me, if I was to step outside the hotel where I am at the moment.
Naomi, obviously prison has to be a punishment for the people who get sent there, but from what we're hearing from the panel, 23 hours a day locked up in a cell, what is the impact on prisoners' mental health, and what have you been seeing in your experience?
Well, I haven't been in a prison for the last 2.5 years, but I have seen a deterioration over time, and I know that when men are in long-term and women are in long-term segregation, which is being locked up 23 hours a day, it's a massive impact on mental health. So when that becomes very widespread throughout the prison system, you're talking about people who, at the extreme end, could become psychotic because they have a history of mental health problems. But it's a very dark, hopeless, depressing place for people to cope. So it's not surprising that we see really high levels of self-harm.
Gloria, back to you. The government was under huge pressure because of the Daniel Khalife escape. Is it a situation that all of this underfunding for years and years now, are they reaping what they've not sown?
Yes, they are. They definitely are. I've been campaigning for 13 years, and in that time we've had 10 justice ministers. It's a brief that nobody really wants. No one is prepared to actually address the huge question as who do we send to prison and why. Successive, writers have said, look at your prisons and you'll see your society. And with the cost of living crisis going on in our society right now, that is magnified tenfold in prisons because the food is terrible. They can't get the staff. Why would you want to work in a prison for minimum wage? They can't retain the staff. All these situations, and the fact that we are the only country in Europe that send children to prison for life just says so much about our society and why we use prisons, because we believe they're places, cages for children rather than somewhere where a child could be helped.
I want to talk about staffing levels. Rob, on the day Daniel Khalife got himself out of Wandsworth, I read that 80 prison officers had not turned up for work that day. How's that even possible?
Yeah, I'd be interested to see the breakdown of that because it may be, obviously there's a rota system, so it's possible that people were not on duty then. There might be illness, but we also know of, unfortunately, very high levels of stress within the workforce as well. And we know that prisons up and down the country are finding it very hard to recruit. In fact, it's becoming increasingly common to read of reports on prisons where more people are leaving the prison than actually joining. Now, that's a massive concern because when there are fewer officers on the wings and there aren't enough officers to safely escort people to activities such as education, employment, training, exercise, that means people are spending hours on end locked inside their cells with all the issues that we've heard about. So it's really important that we see our prisons properly staffed, or we have to think long and hard about what we use prisons for. At the moment, we have a situation where, take Wandsworth, at the day of the escape, had room for 950 men in safe and decent accommodation, and it was holding more than 1,600. Now, if you put staff shortages into the mix as well, that's a toxic combination that's going to lead to problems like the ones we've seen.
Dean, you're in and out of prisons on a very regular basis, providing legal representation to inmates for, say, parole hearings, for example. What are you seeing in terms of staff numbers? Are you seeing problems around Britain's prisons in terms of, people being there, doing their jobs?
100%. The key issue here seems to be the working conditions, the quality and the pay. The prison service cannot retain the staff that it trains, but it's a mess of the government's own making. They made significant changes to the system a number of years ago, and for all of us in the criminal justice system, we all viewed that it was perfectly foreseeable, and the consequences are perfectly foreseeable. So to give you a statistic, there's over 15,000 prisoners currently on remand, so that means they're awaiting trial. Now, the criminal justice system has been underfunded, which means more and more people are waiting longer for their trials. That's 15,000 people that should be having their hearings quite promptly, but instead are having to wait up to 2 years in some cases, for which they might well be acquitted. And that's all time that they can't get back. And plus, it's a stress on the system that simply shouldn't be there if we had a properly funded system.
Naomi, how difficult do you think it is to sell the role of being a prison officer? I mean, in terms of recruitment of staff, it's a very, very challenging job, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, you're going to work in an environment where you're exposed to feelings like feeling frightened, feeling disgusted. When you've got people going there who are very young, and a common joke within the prison services, you can earn more at McDonald's. So why not go and work at McDonald's rather than have the stress of working in work? We don't spend enough time training prison officers. In the UK, we only train people for 12 weeks. In Germany, by comparison, prison officers are trained for 2 years. A lot of countries put people through degrees to become prison officers. And when you look at the level of mental health problems within prisons, prison officers aren't trained to deal with mental health problems, but that's what you've got, buildings which are full of people who've got really severe mental health problems.
Gloria, Naomi mentions Germany. There was a case recently where a suspected Albanian drug smuggler wanted in the United Kingdom had his lawyers successfully argue that he should not be extradited because they felt Britain's prison system was not safe for him.
Yeah.
I mean, has Britain become a laughingstock in Europe to that extent that the Germans are refusing to extradite people here?
I believe it has. I think one thing people don't understand is that is the thing about joint enterprise, that you can have someone serving a mandatory life sentence, which can be anything up to 25 years, for a crime that they haven't actually committed. And on Dean's point, there's apparently 150 prisoners have been on remand for 5 years at the moment. So the idea that we're seeing the NHS being torn apart in plain sight, but people aren't seeing the criminal justice system because they don't think it's going to affect them until you have a loved one sent to prison, especially if it's for something they haven't actually done and if it's something as serious as murder. And then you start trying to fight it, and then you become aware of all the problems, root and branch it needs to be sorted out, because the prison system right now and the criminal justice system is been decimated.
Well, the Ministry of Justice did give us a statement in response to that German situation. So they say in a statement, our prisons meet the standards of the Convention. This is the European Convention on Human Rights, whilst helping to rehabilitate offenders, cut crime and protect the public. We continue to press ahead with delivering 20,000 additional modern prison places and our £100 million investment in tough security measures, including X-ray body scanners, is stopping the weapons, drugs and phones that fuel violence behind bars. I mean, Rob, is the investment actually going in? Are you seeing that?
Well, there is a lot of investment being poured down the drain as more and more people enter a system that's been asked to do too much with too little for too long. I think it's interesting the Ministry of Justice draw attention to the scanners, because I think most people would say the best way to combat drugs and mobile phones and paraphernalia like that in prisons is to remove the demand for them. And how do you do that? You get people out of their cells and involved in purposeful activity. When you have insufficient staff, when you have too many people inside a prison to be able to deliver that, that's when the problems begin. And what you don't want to see are people being held in their cells for hours on end and coming out without any intervention whatsoever, which is what we're seeing at the moment. And I've always said that problems inside prisons will eventually spill out into the towns and cities around them. And so if it was serious about security, we'd be trying to do as much as we can inside prisons, getting people involved in purposeful activity and tackling it that way. And you can't replace those relationships that staff build with prisoners and understand their prisons. And we've lost that. We've lost a lot of experience. I mean, I think what's interesting and what's lost within the figures about the staffing in prisons, yes, there's boots on the ground, you want to call it that, but there's also experience. We've seen a lot of people with many years' experience leaving the service being replaced by people very new, in a completely different environment to which they may have been trained and used to, because, of course, we had prisons in ultra lockdown, if we can call it that, during the pandemic. And so many people are now encountering post-pandemic conditions for the first time. And so that's come as a shock to the system as well. So it's interesting to see them talk about security and talking about the plan to build more places, because that's only going to magnify the issues we already have. And it makes no sense to me or anyone else, I wouldn't think, to build more prisons when there are insufficient staff to run the prisons we already have.
Dean, I want to go back to something you said earlier on, that you believe it's easier to get drugs inside a prison than if you were to step outside of your hotel right now, where you are in York. I mean, I think a lot of people watching will be blown away by that statement, that that is how rife drugs are in the prison system in the UK right now.
Well, that is unfortunately the sad reality. And I say that from, it's an accepted point within many parole hearings that, I did a parole hearing today. And in my closing submissions, I said to the panel, look, one of the risk factors for this chap was substance misuse. He could step outside the parole suite now and come back with drugs within a couple of minutes. It's like that across the entirety of the prison estate. But the Ministry of Justice statement really highlights where the MOJ are coming from. They want to increase the prison population when we're at a point where they can't manage appropriately and safely the prisons that are under their watch at the moment. To say that the prison system meets the European Convention of Human Rights is laughable. I would implore anyone watching this to check out the Chief Inspector of Prison Service reports on any establishment and read the absolute abysmal nature of many of the prisons it reviews, one of which is HMP Wood Hill, which they've had to issue a special and urgent notification for because it is fundamentally unsafe. We're waiting on a High Court judgment at the moment for inhumane and degrading treatment under the breach of Article 3 of the European Convention for a particular establishment. So it's absolutely laughable that the Ministry of Justice come out and seem to say that the prison service and the prisons within our estate meet the ECHR standards. They simply don't.
Naomi, how psychologically damaging is it for prisoners to have access to drugs then when they're inside, they're incarcerated, and drugs have become almost a currency in Britain's prisons?
Well, they absolutely have, and people talk about going into prison having not used substances before and then leaving with a drug habit. You've got people who are bored and want something to do with their time. You've got people who are very poor at managing their emotions anyway. That's a big factor in terms of why people end up in prison. So actually, if you give them if they get the opportunity to access something that numbs the pain and takes things away from them, then a lot of them will choose that. Prison itself does not work, as has already been said. The ways that you cut down the use of drugs, you cut down violence in prison, is by allowing prisoners to have purposeful activity, to engage in relationships with, to feel supported by staff members, feel like they're part of a community. And actually, we don't do that, and you certainly can't do that when people are locked up a lot of the time. A lot of people who are in prison are in there because they've kind of felt society's got no stake in them, and it's a bit of a finger up to the community. And then you put them in prison, they're angry, they feel like they've got nothing left to lose, they're hopeless.
Gloria, you mentioned the high turnover in recent years of justice secretaries in the British government. Is it the case that, that's a brief nobody wants, and the public don't care? There's no votes in this, so the politicians don't care.
Yeah, I mean, successive governments have always been tough on crime. It's always been there since Blair came along, and we talked about black on black crime and feral Britain and broken Britain, and the newspapers sell papers on the back of, these groups of people that are all marauding gangs, and none of it is true. It's not true. It's a way of us teaching society to be frightened of other people in society, and then just locking them up, throwing away the key, and not actually caring about them once they've done that. I mean, Naomi mentioned Germany in prisons, but the best prison system in the world is Norway's. And if they had a child who committed a crime, which has happened, the same as Thompson and Venables, they had a very similar case where 2 children killed another child. They were put into intensive psychiatric help. They were not put into a cage. They were not put into a prison. So the idea that we just think, that any rehabilitation goes on in our prisons is laughable.
But Norway's population, to be fair, is 5 million people, and the UK has 67 million.
Yeah, but we've got one of the largest prison populations in Europe. So, I mean, that's a reflection of who we send to prison, why we send so many people to prison, why we have things like joint enterprise, which is British colonial law that it exists in Australia and it exists in South Africa, and it's just a way of locking up groups. We're probably the most punitive country, I think, in the world. Probably, up there with America, but we just believe in locking people up rather than addressing the root problems of why they might have committed a crime in the first place.
Rob, let's talk about solutions. What would you like to see happen? There's possibly a new government coming into the UK next year, a Labour government, potentially Keir Starmer as Prime Minister. What would you like to see happen?
I think we need to see some reflection, because this is a situation that's been allowed to develop and develop under governments of different stripes. We've seen the prison population double since the 1990s, under Labour governments, under Conservative governments. We've seen new offences created. We've seen sentences get longer during that period. And I think incidents such as the one in Wandsworth make people sit and take notice and think, actually, what have we done here? What have we actually achieved? It isn't tough on crime to create a situation where people are more likely to commit crime after a prison sentence than they were before. That isn't tough on crime. And we need to think seriously about where we want to go next. So right now the government has a plan, as they've said, to build 20,000 more prison places. Their projections indicate that it could rise to about 107,000, the prison population, by 2027. It's currently at about 87,000. It was as low as 78,000 a couple of years ago. Now, we don't have enough staff to run the prisons we already have. The outcomes are not good from the system we currently have. We need to have a sensible, grown-up discussion about who we send to prison and for how long. And the elephant in the room is sentences. Right now, it's a numbers game, and unfortunately, there is no sentence long enough, frankly, that is going to remedy the loss that someone feels when a serious crime has been committed against them. When a terrible thing has happened, as much as we would like that to change, a terrible thing has happened. And as hard as it is, we need to devote our energy to reducing and minimizing the chances of that terrible thing happening to somebody else or happening again. Right now, we have a system that makes it more likely to repeat itself because people are being locked up with nothing to do, with nothing to change their behavior. And we're just living on a hope and a prayer that things will get better all by themselves. What we need to see is a system that actually helps people to move on from crime and lead crime-free lives.
Dean, given your experiences and how often you go to prison to represent inmates, if you could speak to the Justice Secretary or indeed the Prime Minister, what key changes would you like to see them implement?
I think we need to have a proper look at who could safely be released from the prison estate at the moment to reduce the population and improve the situation in the prison estate. And when I say that, I'm not, of course, suggesting we start releasing individuals who are clearly dangerous. But for example, the bulk of female prisoners have not committed acts of violence or sexual offences. So what harm would it cause if there was properly funded community services for them? Because the majority have underlying issues, whether that's mental health or substances. We could look at the remand situation as an issue, but also what we haven't discussed yet is the situation with IPP. There's a whole number of individuals serving what is now an abolished sentence, and the Justice Select Committee has come out and said those should be resentenced, but the government simply won't do that, and they say they won't do it because it would put people at risk. But I go in front of the parole board daily. I've represented a significant number of IPPs, and that is utter rubbish. Within the parole board, we've got a number of judicial members, so judges that have spent time in the Crown Court sentencing individuals. They could be properly and safely tasked with the individual with the basis of resentencing individuals, because ultimately, even the parole process cannot cope with the number of people being recalled to prison and awaiting hearings. You know, recalls, the bulk of recalls to prison, in my experience, are either as a result of breaching minor life conditions or failing to abide by a curfew, something like that, as opposed to further reoffending. But I think the key here is properly investing in community services. When I first started representing prisoners about 15 years ago, if someone was released from prison and they went to a bail hostel, the minimum period was at least 6 months stay, but you'd be looking up to a year. Now, the maximum period is 3 months, and that often is setting people up to fail from the outset.
Naomi, final question to you. What changes would you make? What is the one key change you would deliver if you were Justice Secretary?
I'd like to see more cross-party working on justice so that it's stopped being used as a political football. I think that's why we get these more and more extreme attempts to placate Joe Public with the idea that we're tough on crime. I think the reality is much of the money that's poured into the prison system would be better invested in community alternatives like restorative justice, which victims themselves tend to find better, rather than just building more beds for people which are not going to deliver any kind of meaningful treatment whilst people are occupying them.
Dean, Naomi, Gloria and Rob, thanks for your insight. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me and Brady and all of the team here, thank you for watching.